week, we began discussing the subject of Tefilah B'tzibur in the light of the Halachic sources and Chabad sources. So last week we focused more on the positive, all the Halachic and Chabad that say that it's total chiyuv, and a long list of Lubavitcher Makairis, starting from the Alter Rebbe down to the Rebbe, that will discuss how important Tefilah B'tzibur is and how to do it right. But this time I want to examine the other side of the coin, as it were, and to examine some of the sources that walk it back a little bit, that say maybe the chiyuv isn't so great, and to understand the other side of Chabad, because of the attitude we have when it comes to Tefilah B'arichas, Hisbainos, learning Chassidus, things like that. Where does that all fit in? And or shlichus, going out on shlichus when you're not guaranteed to have a minyan. What's the story about that? So first of all, I want to point out, last week we quoted the Igros Moshe, who wrote very decisively that it's a chiyuv gamor. So the Igros Moshe's big yesod, what was his big raya? His big raya was that you have a Gemara in Pesachim and a Gemara in Chulin, and Rashi explains that you have to walk 4 mil to find the base Knesset, to find the minyan. Even if you want to stop where you are, you have to keep walking. You also have to go backwards up to 1 mil. So first of all, it's kedai to know that that's only lefi shitas Rashi, even though that's what was paskin in Shulchan Aruch. But if you look in the Rambam only brings the halacha of dalad mil when it comes to washing your hands for davening. And it's mashma, that's possibly how he understands the Gemara in Pesachim and Chulin, or he has another girsa. Our girsa in those Gemaras is that legabel, which has to do with tumah, relating to food, well, the tefillah, which according to Rashi is going to a shul, well, the netilas yadayim, which according to Rashi is washing for food, is dalad mil. But the Rambam, if you look at Mishnah Torah, the Rambam only brings this kind of halacha twice in Hilchos Tumah legabel, that din. And then one more time for the Netilas Yadayim for davening. It doesn't mention walking 4 mil to go to a shul. It doesn't mention 4 mil to wash before eating. So a number of Sfarim discuss what exactly was the Rambam's gersa, what exactly was the Rambam's understanding in the sugya. But either way, according to the Rambam, there's no such din b'chlal when it comes to walking to a shul, when it comes to walking to a minyan. So according to him, at least, that whole yesod wouldn't be there to prove how great davening with the minyan is. And I saw that they write that the Rif also is mashmit this halacha. And it's b'chlal shver, why the Shulchan Aruch paskind, Lamar Zagan the Rosh goes according to Rashi and says you have to walk 4 mil to a shul, but Yiddishkeit, the Mechaber has a system that he follows the Rav between the Rif and the Rambam and the Rosh. Usually the Mechaber follows the Rav, so he should have followed the Rif and the Rambam and not paskin that way. No, to Shiloh. So it's fun to discuss it. Mechaber himself says sometimes there are exceptions. Okay. Even according to the Rosh, there's a famous shuvah from the Rosh regarding Tefilah B'tzibur versus learning Torah and Shalos Shuvah Rosh. The Rosh says, Torah ispal matzibur ba'asara. It's good to daven with a minyan versus just sitting and learning. Zman Torah l'chod, zman Tefilah l'chod. There's time for Torah, there's time for davening. And anyway, we don't have Torah Seinu and Asenu nowadays. We waste enough time during the day. So let's be mevatel Torah during davening time, and the other Torah that was so important to us that we didn't want to miss, we can fill that in during some of the other times of the day that we were going to waste doing other things. And that way we'll do both. And the Rosh adds another point that if the Talmid Chacham doesn't daven with a minyan, then others are going to learn a kavana, and they're also not going to care, and the shuls are going to be empty. Because they're not going to understand and assume that he means well, he's just learning. And this last point is actually cited by the Alter Rebbe in Shulchan Aruch and Simon Tzaddik. I might quote a bit from it later on. So on the one hand, the Rosh is writing very much pro Tefilah B'tzibur, but there are also those who pointed out that how does the whole shuvah begin? V'toiv l'espal l'matzibur. So it doesn't sound like he's saying it's a definitive chiyuv. As we mentioned last time also, there are those who medayik in the Shulchan Aruch that says yishtadel, although not everyone agrees with that diuk. But aside from all of that, there's actually a very, very central, important source that very surprisingly Mamish undermines or is going in a totally different direction than the rest of the Makredas that we've seen. And I'm talking about the Maharil, Yaakov Alevi from Germany, lived in the Kufs, very influential in Minhagei Ashkenaz. And you have the Sefer Minhagei Maharil, which is, as is well known, was written by his Talmud, and a lot has been written on that subject, the status of the Talmud and his stature. But the Sefer is very influential, and it's quoted all over Shulchan Aruch. So in Hilchos Halachic Chatzeres, he also deals with Erev Tchumen, and in Ois Zayin, this is what it says. It says in the Perek Ketzah Mishtatfin, in Erevin, that you don't do a Erev Tchumen stam for no reason, just to go somewhere. Only for Dvar Mitzvah, to get you to a Beis HaAvel or to a Beis HaMishta, Abelus, Chasana. So Amar Mari Sagal, which is what he's called in his Sefer by his Talmud, the Leira B'Shum Paisek, he didn't see in a single Sefer of Halacha, Shemuter La'arif Tchumen, Leilech LeBeis HaKnesses, Kedei L'Espal, you can make an Erev Tchumen to get you to a shul which is out of your area. But L'Espal Ba'asara, so you can daven with a minyan. Rak B'Smak B'Sefer Aguda. He actually did find the Smak in the Aguda, but apparently that was not enough for him, so he still framed it as he didn't see it in any Paisek except those two. So he had a Talmud of Ikka, who said, shouldn't going to a minyan be at least as much as going to a wedding? So the Maharil answered him, L'Spal Ba'asara Eina Kol Kach Mitzvah. Davening with 10 is not such a mitzvah. The Yachal Achav and Tefilah B'tzibur. You can daven quite well enough on your own at home. The Lei Ashkechon Asher Tzricha Chacham L'Spal Ba'asara. We don't find Bechlal Chachamim said you have to daven with a minyan. Very surprising. But Beis HaMishta is a mitzvah, and of course we mean dafka Beis HaMishta of a wedding, not just a party. On a personal note, I have a somewhat amusing anecdote related to this Maharil. When I was in Yeshiva Zolei Torah, I was in Shiur of Rabbi Shraga Friedman. So for those who know him, so he had a habit of walking into the Beis Medrash, and he'd make his rounds to the Bachrim and throw a commentary out of there. And if you wanted to engage, you could answer him back. So one time, we got into this type of back and forth. And part of the back and forth, I said, oh, there's a Maharil that says such and such. So right away he says, there's no such Maharil. Shtaza Maharil doesn't exist. I'm willing to bet there's no such Maharil. I said, fine, gladly. I went to Eitzer Sfarim, I found the Maharil, I found the page, I showed it to him, he looked, this way and that, but the point of Maharil is there, that's what it says. I don't think he paid the bet. But how did I know? Of course, it wasn't serious. How did I know about this Maharil? Not that I'm bucky in the Maharil, although to even know of a Maharil is also could be a shtickle pekiyas. But there was a set there of Torah Shlema by Mental Kasher, Menachem Kasher, and in the back of the Chalakim from Sefer Shmois, in the beginning of Vayikra, so each chelik has miluim. He has, in addition to all the Mamar Chazal that he brings on the daf and all the ha'aris, he has miluim, like short or long articles expanding on some of the interesting topics that arose in each chelik. And I used to go through them. It's interesting. So in miluim to Yisrei Aleph, there's one of the miluim is Tefilah B'tzibur, and Hishtam zich on the pasuk V'idata lehem es aderech yelchu ba. And in Targum Emerson Ben Uziel, it says, the Yitzlan beveis knishtahoin. You should tell them how to daven and show. So in relation to that, so he quotes the Maharil, and says, on the other hand, this Maharil saying the opposite extreme, and he gets into the whole topic there, so that's where I had stored that piece of information. Anyway, so that's what the Maharil says. And he says, that when it comes to a wedding, Chachamim or Mater Shvos, you're allowed to tell a guy to play music for a wedding celebration on Shabbos. The Alter Rebbe actually still brings this heter, Halacha L'maisa, in Shulchan Aruch Shabbos. You can tell a guy to play music. And for Beis HaKnesses, we don't see a Dir Mater Shvos. You're not allowed to bring a Sefer Torah through a Carmelis into Shul. That's his raya, which of course can be debated. And he goes on, he says, he told us a story about the importance of a wedding that the wife of the governor or whatever, the duke, whatever whoever the ruler of that area was, died. The wife died, and as a sign of mourning, the Moshel declared that they can't play music for a whole year in that region of Germany. And the Eid Aliyas Nisuin, there happened to be a wedding. Sounds like there weren't that many, but there happened to be a wedding in a yishuv in this Memshala in that year. And they asked Maril if they can have a wedding without music. And he said they should not make the wedding without music because that is the Iker Simcha of the Chassid and Chabad. And if they can't do it there, they have to go somewhere else. And the Taka went 3 parsois from the ear Eipenstein or Epstein to Magenza, and there was outside of that region. Clearly, there were different regions in Germany, and in that region, they were able to do the wedding properly with music. Interestingly, in this Maril, the next kata is actually related to this question of making an aid of Tchumen to go to a minyan. I haven't seen that people who have discussed this Maril, because the beginning of Maril is actually quite well known, relatively, and it is discussed a lot. I don't know if I've seen anyone who actually acknowledges that the next story actually sort of qualifies what he said before. Maril said that there was one time that he was matir to Rabbi Yuzavil, and he says, Rabbi Yuzavil, Hashem Yikim Dame, Me Umas Bravender. What's Umas Bravender? So I saw that someone wrote that Umas Bravender means that he's from Belgium. So I looked it up, looked around, and I saw that Belgium, at least the main part of Belgium, used to be called the Duchy of Brabant. And the national anthem of Belgium is still named after that. So apparently the name Bravender means Belgium. So, yeah. So, Rabbi Yosef Umas Bravender, and explains how he got killed during a certain tumultuous time. Anyways, he lived in a village of Herrlichheim. And Marie Saga Mariel gave him a heter to make an Erev Tchumen so he could walk from Herrlichheim to Vermeise on Shabbos so he could daven with a minyan. Because it was less than 2 Tchumen. And if there would have been a straight road, it would be mamish 1 Tchum. But because the mountains, you couldn't go with a bird's eye route. So, but they measured it and they happened to see. But anyway, so you had to make an Erev Tchumen. So there was a village called Nijhausen with Teichal Payim of Herrlichheim. So he told them to put the Erev in that kfar, and he would take bread from the baker. Why did he take bread from the baker there? Kadesh Le'achshedu B'kshafim. So otherwise, they're gonna. If he brings his own bread and leaves it in the town, who knows what they're gonna think? They're gonna think it's witchcraft. You have to always sidestep touchy issues. So you take the bread from the baker over there, and you should put it in a box. And he made the Erev, it should last for many, many weeks, so you can always just go every Shabbos. But Medal told him that every Shabbos when you get to the village, which is still B'tei Chalpayim, you have to check that the Erev is still there and was still there when Shabbos started. Otherwise, you can't continue going. And even when you get to Vermeise, you have to make sure that you don't go too far past the shul, because maybe your tchum ends over there. And also, once you have this tchum, you can't go in your village of Herrlichheim, you can't go in the opposite direction. So anyways, it was interesting that Mariel actually, Lamaisa was matir, for at least for this person. Even though earlier he said it's not a mitzvah, but the main statement of the Maharil is, even though he didn't write it, as we know, but trusting that this is what he said. He said, "L'spal b'asara enekol kach mitzvah diyochel lachavim tuvasa b'veisei le'ashkachan asher tzrichu chachamim l'spal b'asara." Now, when it comes to the actual question of Erev Tchumen, you make an Erev Tchumen to go to a minyan. So all the achreinim at Tzait Maharil, they all disagree, and they say, "Avada, you're allowed to make an Erev Tchumen," but at any rate, it's very interesting that the Maharil said that. And in fact, the Maharil is actually quoted in some interesting Chabad sources, and we'll get to that in just a bit. Aside from Maharil, they're also mitzayin to the Rashbash. The Rashbash was a Shlomo Duran, the son of the Rashbat, who we quoted last week. Rashbat, we said, was very pro-davening with a minyan. But his son, the Rashbash, lived his whole life in Algeria. He has a short tshuva in Simon Chav Dalet. You asked someone who swore not to go into shul for a set amount of time. Is that someone who swore to be mevatel a mitzvah? Pretty similar to the shayla his father was asked. And can he go to a chacham and get the shvuah and get rid of it? So the tshuva was ein like a nishbal mevatel a mitzvah. It's not like you were overriding a mitzvah here. First of all, it's not a mitzvah d'oraisa. Second of all, you can daven at home. The shosha tzibur misbalim, and it says that if you daven at home and the tzibur is davening, it's like you're davening with the tzibur. So what's the problem? So, and you could do hafara. After that, you don't have to do a shaila anymore once the zman is over. So, not fully saying to how far he would be willing to go with that, but Lamaisa in this case, he said it's not the nishbel or atlas mitzvah, it's not deraisa, flat statement. There's also a famous shuvah from the Yiddishkeit, who lived in the Tufts in the later 1600s. He writes, when I was a Rav in the region of Trier in Germany, in Koblenz, so across from Koblenz, across from the Rhine River, there was a respectable rich man. His name was Berman, and he used to go to shul. He didn't have a minyan in where he lived, but at least on Shabbos, he wanted to go to shul in Koblenz. And there was, he has to cross the Rhine River. So how does he do that? So there was a sort of a bridge that was sort of built over the ships somehow. The planks seemed to have been placed on the ships. But for 3 months during the winter, when the river freezes, so then they would take apart the bridge and they would take away the boats. So that way nothing gets damaged by the ice. So then what do? They still had small boats. You could still cross with a small boat. Also, sometimes it wasn't so cold, even though not every day in the winter is equally as cold. So he asked me if he can come to Koblenz on Shabbos morning to daven with the minyan by renting a boat on Erev Shabbos from a local sailor, and the sailor will take him across. So I didn't want to be matir, the Shiur says, because first of all, there were Rabbanim here before me, and I heard that they were also asked the same question. They didn't say yes, so he just keeps on asking, hoping for a different answer. Why didn't they? Why weren't they matir? So he says it could be because even though it's mamash a shvus to shvus, because you're telling a guy that's one shvus. Crossing the river, crossing the water is another shvus. What's the whole gzeira? Shema yaseh chaviyus shel shayatn. You might make some kind of barrel that serves as a float, a raft. So it's a very gzeira chikamoid. That's going to happen. You're going to try crossing the river in a boat, and all of a sudden you're going to start fashioning a chavis. And then anyway, maybe bismanehem, it was common knowledge, it was a common practice, but nowadays no one's going to make a chavis shel shayatn. Yeah, but similar svar when it comes to clapping on Shabbos, the Alter Rebbe brings that yesh malam and schos, because we don't know how to make klei shir, we don't know how to make klei shir. So sometimes you see these svaras, but Shiur says mikomakom v'regam nespal ba'asara in mitzvah kulahai. Davening the minyan also isn't so big, and he quotes the Maharil, and then he says, "Chalila, I'm not trying to be mamait in the mitzvah say v'nikdashti b'seich b'nei Yisrael, kadesh and baruchu." The minyan and answering Amen, Amen Yeshmir Abba, but in Kol Zeh, still in all, any mitzvah say the Ramya Alei. There's no mitzvah incumbent on him that he must go, wakes up in the morning, he must leave his house and go to shul. And anyway, the minyan will be fine, just fine without him. It's not like the whole minyan will be in a spatel if he doesn't show up. He says, but didn't he done, if the taka was, if it was taka 10th guy for a minyan, and he's being mashed in the minyan, and if there's a boat going Shabbos morning anyways, then maybe it'd be more of a heter. But that's not what happened, he says. I wasn't asked about that. So that's moot. In this case, if there's another boat that's going anyway, so he doesn't want to be vatal minyan kriyasateira, so mitzara svara, I'd want to be mekel. But gzeira d'Rabbanan, Shabbos, shvus to shvus, you can't just mess around with gzeira of chachamim. Sometimes the gzeira of chachamim is also chizuk d'vrei me'esim mishal Torah. And to gather to Mekadosh Shmoi B'Rabim, that's how he frames it throughout this shuvah b'chlal. If you pay attention, some of the shuvahs frame it around v'nikdashti, and some of the shuvahs frame it around the Maila, like the Ramesha, that your whole tefillah, Tishkin tefillah, it's not miskabel properly unless it's with a tzibur. You'll notice different shuvahs emphasize different points. But he's talking about the v'nikdashti. So even to gather to Mekadosh Shmoi B'Rabim, no matter how great it is, but it's only mitzvah d'Rabbanan. That's what he says. That's how he weighs in on that. And the whole tefillah, most places can hold us d'Rabbanan. This is all stuff that Rashbat's also touched on, as we quoted last week. And the real v'nikdashti is really mesiras nefesh in front of 10 people, not stam davening and shul. And the Kriyas HaTorah, he also says, is Moshe Rabbeinu's takana. Ezra was mashlim with takana. It's only d'Rabbanan. So anyway, he says when it comes to Chazal, you can't just make comparisons and say, oh, sometimes they're matir this shvus in this case. I think this case is similar. Let me move out to matir the shvus here. We don't make comparisons because you never know. One thing is more chamer this way. One thing is it also has a tzad kal that makes it different. So memela seif davar, you can't be matir. Any gzeira d'Rabbanan be'esek mitzvah to be medama milsa l'milsa, and even a bittul mitzvah d'Rabbanan. And Rosh Hashanah, so now it seems like he's tilting back to the other way, that even if it was mitzvah d'Rabbanan, Rosh Hashanah comes to the shofar, we wouldn't allow someone to come on a boat to be mashlim the minyan so they can blow shofar b'Rabbanan, even though they're being mevatel kama mitzvahs. The ein lanu moiznei tzedek b'zeh. How are we going to weigh? How are we going to?
It's only one for us by the shofar, but we're not mevatel.
Okay.
This is the difference in shos to shos.
He just said we can't compare. That's what he said. Only what Chazal said, klar, that you know. They said that the guy can bring. That's one thing. But to do this, ladaf. Even though he says, "Af kiyomer razal behadya shofar Rosh Hashanah mavirin chulu." So I'll be the shami tu l'leim l'goy. Yesh l'chalek b'sfina ha'hilachas b'shviloi. Here the boat is taking. Chazal said, Shofar Rosh Hashanah ain't mavin out. Other shvus and Chazal said, "Klar, you're not allowed to do." Came to the shvus telling me, "Guy," they said, "You are allowed to do it." But so in one shvus they said, "Yeah," one shvus they said, "No." So in his case, the boat's going for you. That's how the Chavis Yar passed. Now it's interesting that this Maril and this Chavis Yar are actually quoted and cited in Chabad Makairis. Already back then, during that incident, I looked around to see who else talks about Maril, and I found that the Nechemia of the Bravina has a tshuva about this. You look in Chelik Yeredeya, Shtaila Chavav. It's about Hilchas Avelis, and the tshuva is addressed to someone who was mekel that an oval for his father or his mother should, during the week of Avelis, should be able to leave his house and go to shul at night in order to say Kaddish. This is based on Masha Pilpul B'Sefer Beis Nun Aleph Siman Ches. In that Sefer, he was matir that every oval can go to shul b'chlal to hear Kaddish and Kedusha. So this person who's around the tshuva didn't go as far, but based on that, he was matir at night. Who's the Beis Nun Aleph? So looking at it, I assumed it's the Binas Adam. And it's taka, it is in fact in Chai Adam, Chachmas Adam, the Binas Adam. So Chai Adam is on Eire Chaim, Chachmas Adam is on Yere Deya. In Chachmas Adam, there's also the Binas Adam, which has like the Iyunim on Yere Deya. However, this actual piece is not in the Binas Adam, at least in all the editions that I could see. It's in the end of Chachmas Adam. There's a Hisafa there called Matzevas Moshe, named after the Chai Adam's son, Rav Moshe, who passed away at the age of 20. It's big Talmud Chacham, as he describes, helped him with preparing the Sefer. So he has a conscious right at the end with some points on Yoni Avelis dedicated to his son. And he writes there, the time is there, that it says in Shulchan Aruch, Ha'avu, and Yitzah B'chil Beis HaKnesses, Ha'avu B'Shabbos Yitzah. He says, you know why the Shulchan Aruch says that? The Shulchan Aruch says that because it says elsewhere it's a mitzvah to have a minyan in the Beis HaAvel. So there's a minyan in the Avel's house. But if you can't get a minyan together for the Avel, so and he's going to lose Kaddish and Kedusha and Baruch Hu, Chachmas Adam says, I say he can go. So Kvay Terasa, whoever the Mechem de Bravna is writing to, wanted to rely on that at least for the night. Because the Ramah also says that Miyu HaMekel Latze is Balayla, you're not to leave the house. But how? Someone who's Mekel, Avu who's Mekel during the week of Avelis to leave the house at night, for an important need, Lehevsit. It's okay. So, you want to be Mitzaref, Mekel by night, the Chachmas Adam is Mekel B'chlal, so let's be Mekel with Kaddish by night. So the Divin Nechemia said, first of all, that whole diuk about the night, that has nothing to do with a case where you're walking to a public area. If you're leaving your house to walk from one house to another house, that's one thing. You're going to a public area. No, a novel can't go to the public area. And the Rabbi Chachmas Adam himself wanted to say that the Isser isn't Chal B'Chalal on things that are L'tzeirech, and here it's L'tzeirech and a Mitzvah Rabbah, so the Isser was never applicable to going to a minyan. Rabbi Nechemia says, no. If you look in the Mekayres that precede, the Rishonim, the Achreinim, it doesn't stem, it doesn't line up. You have to look in the Nechemia, it's a whole arichas. Then he gets to this point. He says, Me'ata over the Mashakasa b'Sefer Binas Adam. He claimed that Chazinon shu mitzvah rabbah, that going to mean is a mitzvah rabbah, so we have to, it's a tzarech, we have to be matir. He says, Hine kvarnei the Mashakasa of Maharil. He quotes the Maharil. Well, but Shubas Chavis Yair, Hevizer. And Chavis Yair brought it, V'siyim, Chalila, Chalila to disparage Vim Dashti, but in Kolza, as you quoted before, it says V'ayin Sham, that the Chavis Yiur says this cloud, that you can't be Medama, one case to another case. Brings it all to Kitzer. It says, the Magen Avraham argues in the Maril when it comes to the actual din of Erev Tchumen. The Maril said you shouldn't make an Erev Tchumen. The Magen Avraham said you should make an Erev Tchumen. So maybe we're disregarding the Maril. So the David Nechemia says, no. Yesh Leimar, that there's no raya that he's been chaylik on the etzem idea that it's Eina mitzvah, Eina kol kach mitzvah. He was just arguing on the get of Erev Tchumen. According to Magen Avraham, the standard of Erev Tchumen is lighter. You can make an Erev Tchumen even for something that's Eina kol kach mitzvah. Who says he's arguing about the actual gather? But it's a very strange thing for the Maril to say. If you look at the Gemaras regarding Tefilah B'tzibur, you'll find that you see they're makel. The Gemara, everyone mentions that the Gemara says you're not feeling well with this or that. So because we shouldn't be in the Tumaya Kalkach, we shouldn't be so surprised and taken aback what the Maril said. And he must mean that when he says the way Ashkechan she'etzrichu, the Chazal didn't mamish weren't matzlich, it means they weren't matzlich derech chiyuv gomer. And he adds in parentheses, Movad she'ein dvarav zal tzrichen chizak hayadua, kama rav guvrei, asher kol min hagenu nisyasto al pivzal. We don't have to come to Maril's aid. He's so influential in our halach, in our minhag, or minhagim are based on the Maril. So he throws in that line to burnish the Maril's credibility. So from there, he ends up summarizing that he's completely debunked the Chachmas Adam completely, and he goes on more length, and he's mesakin klolish shadavar mikol anal near lafeni as daiti the ein la'ava leilach beis hakneset b'shultilu b'tzibur gam deleka minyan bevesa v'gam balayla. Then he asks again, maybe saying Kaddish is also covered on mess. It's not just for the Avot, it's for the mess. But there's another Maril. Happens to be there's another Maril. At the end of the Sefer Menagah Maril in Hilchos Avelos, it says that when Maril's wife passed away, so he and his son went to Shul on Shabbos, as is the din. Matzah Shabbos, they stood at the entrance of the Shul until Baruch, and then they went home. So if they stood at the entrance of the shul to Baruch and they went home, is mashma, they didn't have a minyan in their house. Why are they standing outside shul for Baruch? And on the other hand, they don't have a minyan in their house, and they didn't stay, especially his son, who it's Av V'imai, his mother, the son didn't stay to say Kaddish. So from here we see clear from Maril that even Kaddish. Again, he concludes, the Gambik in Kaddish, and that's how that's his conclusion on Halacha L'maisa. So he really builds on this on both Marils. Now, I'm not bucky to know what they say Halacha nowadays. I saw on one of the Chabad websites that they had short Shalos Chuvas, and one Rav wrote that Pesachim discuss it, and L'maisa, if there's no minyan in the Rav's house, you can go to Shul for Kaddish, do it as privately as possible, to go in a car and find a Shul with very few mispalim. His makar is the Nittik Avril. I look in the Nittik Avril, and I see he brings the Chachmas Adam, but not the David Nechemia. Kapanim, we see the David Nechemia built his argument on this Maril. And then I saw that this Maril and the Chavis Yiur and the David Nechemia are also cited in a very interesting context by the Rebbe Rashab. The Igros Kodesh of the Rebbe Rashab, and then was printed in Shalos Shuvas Teil Shalom Siman Test. There's a very long shaila from the Rebbe Rashab about turning a Cheder Sheni of the Shul in Lubavitch, in the Hoif, turning the Cheder Sheni, which had an Aron Kodesh inside. It was mamish like a mini room for davening. To turn that, or part of it, into an Ezras Nashim for his mother, Rebbetzin Rivka. And this is what it says. La'achav me'aleim dim deploy. That's who it's addressed to, one of the Lumdim. Please tell us, Halacha L'maisa, if we're allowed to change the Cheder Katan of the minyan of my father, of Admor Deb Marash, who passed away, where they daven there sometimes with the minyan, and apparently they have Kriyas HaTorah there every Shabbos, ever since it was built. And it's already 9 years that there actually is an Aron Kodesh with a Sefer Torah there, following the instructions of the Marash, because the main Aron and the main minyan didn't even have enough room for all the Sefer Torah. So the Marash had to make another Aron with a Sefer Torah in this room. And now the Rabbanas Tichya, she was davening in the Aliyah Al Ezras Nashim. She had to go up a flight, so now it's hard for her to go up the stairs, especially when it's very frigid weather. I guess they weren't able to control. It could get icy and slippery indoors. or is outdoors. But whatever the case is, she can't eat kamachi efshala b'shamayfin. She can't get up, and she always daven with the minyan, and it's important to her. So we want to turn the cheder katan, the part of the cheder katan, into an ezras nashim, and we're going to have to make a window in the wall now. Another small point: we're going to have to make a window between the wall, in the wall that separates the main shul from the cheder katan. And the whole arichas different stadim of whether this is okay or not. I'm just going to mention a few interesting points he raises before we get to the point that's Nagel in Yanenu. First of all, when it comes to Beis Knesset Derabim, a Beis Knesset Derabim has a higher status than a Beis Knesset Yachid. Now, this is the Rebbe Marnash's own private shul. However, the Magen Avraham says, the Magen Avraham Taka says that Derabim means that when others participated, it belonged to a group. Here, the Rebbe Marnash built it on his own. However, when it comes to Beis Knesset Derabim, if you look in the Rishonim, there's different timing, and some of them apply even here. And then he adds in parentheses, "V'gami shleimar shema'at chomer beis hamedrash yeshkan." This also has a bit of the chumrah of a beis medrash. B'tzadach shaya omer sham. The Marnash used to say chassidus in dafka in the cheder katan, so maybe it's also a shtickle beis medrash. Weiter later in his dalad, another svara he mentions is another reason to be mekel is that everyone knows you do a koil that before they were going to go into this house, into this minyan, the Marnash made a tanai that he could do whatever he wants, whenever he wants. He says, no one remembers what the exact lashon was, but Mistama, the Marnash said it, b'oifen hayeser moil. He said the most effective tanai that he could have. The gam be'es nisui b'noi harazah, and when his son Razah was married, in Tafel Shlamet Daled, asu shama suda and klei zamer, they made the sudas chachasana in that room. Apparently back then it wasn't ever possible to make simchas and shuls. So the fact that they made the chasen in this room is a point towards making the case that there's a tanai here. And the Par 11 in the Hara says that we know from other sources that usually they made the simcha in the big hall, but there was no heating in the big hall, and it was in the winter. It was cheshvan, so they had to make it in that small room. He said, and the Rebbe said at that wedding that he's doing it because of the tanai. But other shuls are also al tanai, and yet they seem to have all the chumras. And Zvav, he says, he gets to the question of, let's say the father made a tanai. Does that transfer over to the children? Do the children also have that power? So different svarim say different things. And Rabbi Rashab says, in this case, since they didn't make any chalukah b'chlal, they didn't divide the property. According to Rabbi Rash's tzava, and on the bottom, 11 is Mitzayin, that based on the tzava that we have, the tzava in Hebrew is missing. Parts of it are missing. In the Russian, apparently there's also a tzava in Russian that Taka says pretty clearly that the mother is sort of keeping the whole estate, and everyone will get their expenses from the estate. So they never really divided the estate. So yesh loymar da kol b'chaskasai. So it could be it's like still all Reb Marash is running the show. And now in Yanenu, and Zayin, he says yesh loymar that we should be makel here because mela to be moitzi beis knesses l'chulin. That's a big deal. But here we're not being moitzi the beis knesses l'chulin. We're just making it into an ezras nashim. Ezras nashim, you can't say ezras nashim is mamish like turning it into choil. Because when it comes to smicha, we know in the Gemara it says they allow the women to do smicha mishum nachas ruach. So we want the women to feel good, feel like they're participating. So and the Tzemach Tzedek himself has shuvas regarding knocking down a wall, rearranging things a little bit because of his ezras nashim. And the Tzemach Tzedek mentions there this svara that he's being mitzvah of that to be makel to knock down the wall for the nachas ruach l'nashim. So maybe it's also, because it says, the Makeda say that if you use the shul to feed aniyim, that could be something that's okay. So maybe an ezras nashim is like at least as good as feeding aniyim. Then he says, Agam shegofi in Tefilah B'tzibur. However, the whole inyan of Tefilah B'tzibur itself, I'm trying to say how great ezras nashim is. How great is Tefilah B'tzibur? So look in Divrei Nehemiah, Tshuva Chavav, B'Shem Maril, Shekasav, L'Ispal V'Asara in a mitzvah kol kach. So he quotes the Maril by way of the Divrei Nehemiah. Ve'achav Yisyar Masigoy V'yu Miyashvoy. Asaga, an answer. So it says, except for Kriyas HaTorah, that's Al Kapanim to Kanas Moshe Nevi'im. The way the Rebbe Rashab frames it is that's more chum than Tefilah B'tzibur. Kapanim gets back to his point, and he says, since it was her minhag her whole life, she always davened with the minyan, so for her it's a mitzvah and haga tova. Maybe that can also be a sniff to be matter that it's not mamash being mitzi the room l'chol. Ein sham oid. And the last, actually, mamash this summer, in one of the Kavtze artists of the yeshiva in Toronto, they actually printed, supposedly for the first time, the response of Rav Zalman Neimark, who's at least one of those who received the Shaila, and he addresses a number of the Nakudas in the Shaila, but I didn't see that he addresses this Nakuda of the Tefilah of Nashim, the Tefilah B'tzibur. There are many other Sfarim that try to be Magdir also. Back to our point, there are many other Sfarim that try to be Magdir that it's less than a regular Chiyuv. We obviously can't go through all of them. But generally, when you go through the Sfarim nowadays, everyone accepts that it's a Chiyuv. They cite the Maharil, but it's only when you're weighing one thing versus another. And no one goes out and says that, at least no one that I saw goes out and says that, it's Tak Mamish with Maharil made it sound like it's Mamish, not important. We use it to weigh when one thing, like it's the Chavas Yor. The Chavas Yor was weighing, and you'd be matir shvos to shvos for this type of thing. So then you have to weigh how important exactly, or the Divinachem is weighing versus the Isser for an oval to leave his house, to be seen in public. So if they're being makel, it's always being makel. L'gabe certain Talmud Torah, mostly that you have klar, like the Alter Rebbe and Simon Tzaddik says. The Alter Rebbe, it doesn't go as far as the Rosh, and he says if Terasayim Nasai, if you taka learn Torah all day, you're not misbatel klal, you don't waste time except for Dvar Mechreichim. So then you shouldn't be mevatel your learning to go to shul, daven at home with a minyan. If you don't have a minyan, it's still better to daven at home than to waste your time going to shul. If it became, then the Alter Rebbe quotes the Rosh's idea that you shouldn't get into the habit, because then the Amir Aretz are also going to stop going to shul and won't be any shul. So you see that Alter Rebbe weighs Talmud Torah as being more important than going to Tefilah B'tzibur every day, Halacha and Chassidus. So the question is going to be, if you say it's not a complete chiyuv, so when L'maisa can we say that we can override the chiyuv and something else is more important? And by the way, even those who say it is a chiyuv gomer, Moshe also agrees that you don't always have to go all the way. It comes to tircha up to a certain point. Losing money, no. So at some point, it's not even clear how much of a real discussion this is and how much it's just semantics, because everyone agrees that it's important. Everyone agrees there are exceptions. Maybe they disagree in specific cases, but so maybe there's a spectrum. Maybe that depends on how big the chiyuv is according to that opinion. Now, one common thing you have nowadays is people go on trips. They go on a trip out of the city and they don't necessarily have a minyan. So you have in the Shas and Shivas Yad Eliyahu from 300 years ago, Rabbi Eliyahu of Lublin, other cities. He writes, Ma'aseh b'chol yom, that we go lefil l'tayel, even just for a trip, kama parsais, and we don't daven with the minyan during that whole time. Ein peitzah b'zeh alas, and no one ever claimed that it was a problem. He says, you know why? It's because you're going b'shas heter. When you left, it was still, you weren't mechuyev in the minyan. The chiyuv comes later. When the chiyuv comes later, you're already pater. So you're not doing an aveda, it's just the meniyas ha-mitzvah. Mashenkin, in the case that he was discussing, then it would be an aveda. He calls it being an aveda. If you could daven with a minyan, you're just staying home, then he calls doing an aveda. And in the next shub in the Yad Eliyahu, he also goes on at length. There he calls it a hiddur mitzvah. He's the one who was medayik about the lashon yishtadel. Actually, he may have been the first to say yishtadel. You see, it's not mamish chiyuv. Aruch HaShulchan, when it comes to trips, when it comes to business, he says pshita. This is the regular halacha and Shulchan Aruch, that you can't just leave in the morning if that's going to mean missing out on the minyan, even if you leave before the daybreak. But we're not user, just like the Yad Eliyahu says. Practically, we see people going all the time because we're going for parnasa. So not for trips, so for parnasa, and that's a dvar mitzvah because it's a mitzvah to support your family, your wife for sure, your children. The Gemara says is oisit tzedakah b'chaleis. So you have an inyan to support your family. And anyway, when the Shulchan Aruch said that you shouldn't leave, that was dafka when you were able to get to your destination in time. But if you can't get to your destination in time, for fun. By the way, that svara of dvar mitzvah pops up in other discussions as well. Mostly when it comes to Shana Rishayna after marriage, so you have the Sefer Chinuch that one of the people spoke about Shalom Bayis also cited. It explains the importance of the Shana Rishayna. And the Sefer Chinuch goes much further than everyone else and says that you're not to leave, not the Yila Beisa, it means that the husband's not allowed to leave for any reason. So the Stei Chemed has a whole arichas about this and asks, practically, what about Parnasa? People that, and he says, Lamaisa, back in Europe especially, it seemed to be very common that people who were already in business, or after they got married, they did leave on business trips right away. So this figures in the discussion, is Parnasa a Dvar Mitzvah? Because maybe a Dvar Mitzvah is mutter, overrides Naki Yilabesa, and then Parnasa is a Dvar Mitzvah, so that's one factor that comes up. Most of Nida. So there's a special din of someone who goes Yetz Ladarach, he has a special chiyut to Mefayas his Ishtoi, except for a Dvar Mitzvah. Now, is going for Parnasa a Dvar Mitzvah, so it comes up there as well. So the Aruch HaShulchan uses it here, Lagabe leaving and not having a minyan. When it comes to losing money, we also, as far as say, Rumekel, because Moshe mentioned it, Mishnah Brura writes it like this. You have an Einis Mamain that by being Mishtadel to daven, you're going to lose money. You can daven at home, biyachid, or in the shul without a tzibur. But if it's just going to prevent you from gain, Meniya Sarevach, he says, according to Mishnah Brura, that can't stop you from davening with the minyan. Takes a stronger view of the chiyuv. Because there's a difference between Meniya Sarevach and Hefsid Mikisa. Are you going to lose money from your pocket, or are you simply not going to gain? And he quotes from a very interesting source from the Shem Yaakov, which is just an interesting sefer that was printed in Prague, in like the late Tufts. And it says there, a Maisa about Reb Zalman Mirals. This is a story that's quoted in the Mishnah Brura. Reb Zalman Mirals, I believe I saw he was the Shiur Chacham Tzvi. He was the Av based in Hamburg. And one time he was going to shul. He had his talis and tefillin on already. He was walking with the talis and tefillin. Kedarkei, and someone met him. He was trying to sell some precious gems. And he wanted that Reb Zalman should come to his house. And Reb Zalman said, please wait. I have to go to shul. If you want to wait, I'll wait till I come back from shul. Meanwhile, the guy was in a hurry. The guy sold the gems to someone else. And that person, Hirviach, Kama Alafim Reish Tes. Now, what's Reish Tes? Just footnote. I saw that in Ois V'Hadar, they were Faneyachet, Rubel Taler. That's ridiculous. Rubel doesn't go along with Taler. Reish Tes is Reichstaler. That was the currency in Hamburg. So he Hirviach Kama Alafim Reichstaler. And the guy was very happy that he was able to lose such a large amount of money for the sake of Tefilah B'tzibur. That's what the Mishnah Brura quotes in the Pnim. Then he quotes from the Al Yerabah, who quotes from the Chuvas Beis Yaakov, that you have to have a knas to people who don't go to shul because they're learning Torah or because they're making money. And for rich people, you have to give a bigger knas. And even for a Baal Torah, even if he's learning, there's chshad, there's chil Hashem. Okay, getting to Chabad. Now in Chabad, as we said, there's 2 points. Aside from all the milas of Tefilah B'tzibur, you also have on the counter, on the other side of the scale, you have davening by arichas or isbayanos, and you also have shlichus. So what do our Makaitis talk about it? So interestingly, I don't know if any of the early Makaitis from the early generations actually explicitly mention this kind of practice of being ma'irech and not davening with a minyan. I think if you look in the Ksavim, the Misnagdim, who are complaining about what the Chassidim are up to, I think you'll find that they complain about the Nusach HaTfilah, about strange motions during davening, about breakaways, making their own minyanim, about being Mevatel Zman Tfilah. I don't recall that they ever complained that they're being Mevatel Tfilah b'minyan. If you look in the letters of the Rebbeim, the Alter Mitzvah Tzemach Tzedek, they're all talking about how to daven somewhat barichas with the minyan. However, from later generations, we do have stories that date back to Chassidim from the early generations, but how they davened all day. And that's besides what we know more like firsthand from the Rebbe Shab's generation and on, how people who davened barichas. The Fidik Rebbe also, we do find something which is, again, the Fidik Rebbe is writing much later, but about the time of Mittel Rebbe, that there was a phenomenon of not davening with a minyan for a different reason. It's in the Kuntras Limud Chassidus. It's also printed in Yiddishkeit Fidik Rebbe Chele Gimel and Ois Hey. Since this week is a week that's connected to Mittel Rebbe, so quoted at some length. In Ois Dal, the Fidik Rebbe describes that among the Menagdim, the opponents of Chassidus, there were 2 camps. One camp was Ragzonis, was very noisy, very angry, very aggressive and looking to hurt, to target. And the second group, they're very sunnah, they're very calm, and they're very logical. And we know about the first group, that's much more famous, but the second group is not as well known. And they used to come with their comments and their logic, and they would try to kill up Chassidim, from Teres Chassidus and Darkei Chassidim. They're very undercover, and from after the second arrest, when the first group's tactics had finally pretty much failed, so that's when the second group started trying to influence and make debates, and it was causing a chalishos at the periphery of the Chabad community. He says that the Menagdim from the second group used the Alter Rebbe's own words, Paiskim Bevracha and Geras HaKodesh, about sort of Shiur, Paiskim B'Torah, and other places, wherever the Alter Rebbe speaks about Galia, Shabbatayra, they went to the Chassidim and said, see, look, the Alter Rebbe himself says how important Nigla is. So Reishis Koil, Tzrichim, you have to keep the Zmani Halimud and Shas and Paiskim. That was one of their tactics. The Rebbe says. And then in Ois Hey says when the whole war with Napoleon broke out, then when that calmed down, he says these Menadim started sending secret messengers around to convince the Chassidim not to be Niskasher to the Mittel Rebbe. That way there won't be continuity. And when they saw that that's not working, so they thought that the Mittel Rebbe, they considered him, they thought he had a passive temperament, a timid personality. So they figured they'll be able to sort of run him over, which didn't turn out to be the case. And then at some point, when the Mittel Rebbe finally arrived in Lubavitch, about a year later, in Tov Vayin Dalet, to fully take control of the Nesius, so he sent out very strong tzav pekuda to all the cities in White Russia. The Chassidim should make it a priority to build their own shuls, and they should not go into daven, even ba'akrai, even just on a chance, into the Bati Knesses and the Bati Medrash of the Menagdim. And if you're over on this, you'll be punished by being kept away from the Rebbe or from the other Chassidim. There were cases when Mittel Rebbe told a Nash who lived in towns where there was no minyan of a Nash, they should daven b'yechidus. And Kriyas HaTorah, they can listen from outside the shul, from behind the door, behind the window. And the Rebbe says, I still had the chance to meet one of the Chassidim, Mittel Rebbe in Vitebsk, who had been a resident of Lida, and he said in the 5 years he lived in Lida, so Elo Tishrei, he was in Lubavitch. But besides for that, a whole year he did not daven B'tzibur until he moved to Shvinsan, and then he had a minyan of Anash. And the continues that he said you can't get into any debates, and then he says they were hoping that maybe the feud with the Brian Strashella or Shlomo Freidis is going to help their cause, and that didn't work out either. Very interesting history that the Rebbe writes in that countries. So that's an interesting makar about not davening with a minyan, but not mitzvah arichas, just mitzvah association. Of course, when it comes to davening by arichas, you have the word that the Rebbe said, b'shem his zayda, also Rabbi Yitzchak of Avruch, the son of the Tzemach Tzedek, who was the son-in-law of Rabbi Yaakov Yisrael of Cherkas, who was the son of Rabbi of Chernobyl, and the Eidim of the Mittel Rebbe. So the Chabad Chernobyl connection there. The Rebbe was an anical. So in Hatomim, in the article of Veis Chassidus in Gilead Beis, it says that the Rebbe Rashab married Avruch's daughter in Avruch, and there was a whole parsha there with that wedding, and the Rebbe Rash didn't go. But the Rebbe Rashab told me how special his shver, my Zayda, Rabbi Yitzchak was, and how much he learned in his midas and his anova, and he said that he heard all this from his father, Marash, when he made the shidduch. And Marash told him how special his brother Rabbi Yitzchak is. And so he says that he said the following ma'aseh, that Rabbi Yitzchak was a Baal Avoda, and when he was by Yaakov Yisrael Cherkas, by his shver, his father was Chernobyl, his shver was Mittel Rebbe, so he was half and half. So he asked his Eidim, what's your Seder davening? So he said, as much as possible, I daven B'tzibur. So his shver Rabbi Yaakov Yisrael Cherkas once was finished davening, and he sent a call for his son-in-law. The shliach came back and said he's still davening. A while later, he sent again. The shliach came back and said he's still davening. Weiter a third time. Each time he's still davening. So when he finished davening and he finally came to his shver Rabbi Yaakov Yisrael, so he said, I understand, you told me you daven B'tzibur. So Rabbi Yitzchak of Avruch said, B'shem the Alter Rebbe, that I know, the Alter Rebbe told me, or told us, that Tefilah B'tzibur means B'tzibur, Litzbur, Kol HaBirurim, Lessen B'tfilim, gathering all the Birurim, that's the Tzibur. So Kama she'efshali, Hineni Mishtadel, Espal B'tzibur, as much as possible. I try to daven B'tzibur, like that. The Rebbe used to quote this a lot, as you mentioned last week. The Rebbe brings it slightly, the signet is that The tzibur is you're gathering the eser kaiches and nefesh. That's the 10. The 10 is you're gathering the 10 kaiches of your own nefesh. So there, it does mention that a lot in the context sometimes of Tefilah B'tzibur. So that's another vart on that theme that goes back to a number of datas. Last week we also cited the letter of the Fidik Rebbe, Benegay the Yeshiva Tzemach Tzedek in Yerushalayim, and how they reacted to the takanas of Kavana Chabad, that you should daven with the Tzibur, and minyan Chabad, and they were medayek, that this is the Fidik Rebbe is hinting that you don't have to daven with Be'enos, because why did the Fidik Rebbe come and tell us a din in Shulchan Aruch? The Fidik Rebbe said, excuse me, Avada, we tell you dinim in Shulchan Aruch, there's no diyukim here, I wasn't even as anything. Now when it comes to the actual Halacha and Chassidus, so how does it work vis-a-vis davening with the minyan? So we find from the Rebbe Shraga and on, the Fidik Rebbe and the Rebbe all have letters. And you'll note again that some of them address more the issue of Vinikdashti, of the Davar Shabbat, and some of them address the idea of the Tefilah being Miskabel. So there's a letter in the Yiddishkeit Rabbi Shraga. It's also included in Shut Torah Shalom to Reb Nachman Yisrael Mariashin, that apparently he had asked, how does it work with the halacha b'chlal? So the Rabbi Shraga writes, Oid mi yom mikedem. He's also attesting that this is going way back. As long as you're davening at the same time that others are davening, we mentioned this in the Halachic and Chabad, that is a factor. That was what the Rashbash said, that you're davening at the same time that they're davening. What's the problem? Even if it's not in your town, even if somewhere else there's a minyan at the same time, it's also good. And you can certainly rely on that now, and you should not be memar chas v'shalom because of this concern during davening. And you have to try to daven, and Hashem will help. The Fidik Rebbe, there's a letter in Ignis Ched Gimel, it's also in Sefer HaMinhagim, that they paskin la halacha, those who asked about Tefilah B'tzibur, how can you do both? Arichas B'tfilah and daven B'tzibur. They answered that Tefilah B'tzibur is b'shah tzibur mispalim, so you daven at the same time. And when you get a davar shebekdusha, you should take a listen to Kadesh and Baruch Kedusha Kriyas Torah, all the Kadesh, and then daven slowly. Ish kefi asagas yad sichla. You have a number of letters from the Rebbe. One of them is from Tafshin Yud Aleph to Reis Yehuda. And you asked that you're davening so slow and you're losing out on Tefilah B'tzibur or even Zman Tefilah. So the answer is, we know that in Halachic Chassidim, and very often it was with instructions of the Rebbeim, that Tefilah B'tzibur, you listen to Baruch Hu, Kedusha, Kriyas Torah with a minyan, and then you daven, B'mesinus, even Barichas. And he quotes the Vart with the Avrutcher from Atomim, that Tzibur means the Mekabetz, the Koiches, the Aser Koiches Nafshay. From Tafshin Tezayin, there's a letter to Ritzak Dubov in Manchester. Nifhalti, I was shocked to hear that you're asking that until now you daven on Shabbos, b'Mesinas, and b'Arichas Ma'at. Now you're asking, should you continue or not? Pasha, it's not a shayla b'chlal, after we know how important it is about the inyan of Tefilah, and the only thing that overrides that, the Rebbe says, is Teirach Tzibur. If your davening b'Arichas is causing Teirach Tzibura, then you shouldn't. You see with Rabbi Kiva, that when he davened privately, he rolled around, and when he davened mitzvah, he davened normally. So I don't understand your question, Bechal. Kiyem, that I guess is just an opportunity for me to be ma'ater you, that you shouldn't only daven Marichas on Shabbos, like you've been doing until now, but Mizman Lizman, maybe you should actually expand it to the weekdays also. That's probably why it is nisgalgal that you should reach out to me, because weekdays also have to be me'ain of Shabbos. We say, Yom Echad b'Shabbos, Yom Sheni b'Shabbos, so every day of the week is building up to Shabbos, and some say it's mamish one of the Aseres HaDibros, to Zachas Yom Shabbos, the Kadshay, to say that today is Yom Echad Shabbos, that the count is always towards Shabbos. So the weekdays also have to have some Tefilah B'Arichas, and Ashkach made Yom Hashpiyah, Tefech Amanas L'Atzpiach, so in order for others to be Mispal, Akapanim B'Shabbos B'Arichas, so you should be Meisef even B'Chad. There's also a letter from Tafshin Tezvav, where someone said that he's already got used to davening B'Arichas, and he's not hearing Kedusha from the shot as a result, as he starts at the same time, and then by the time the Chazan gets to Kedusha, he's Chveisful. So what, should he continue this minute, or should he be Mekatzer in order to hear Kedusha? So the Rebbe says, move on, that based on the Yisod and Halacha, the main aspect of Tefilah is the kavana, and that is a whole different subject. I believe we spoke about it before the light started here. It was one of the weeks before. This whole Nekuda about kavana and davening. And the Rebbe cites Reb Chaim Brisker, the famous Reb Chaim Brisker on the Rambam, that a certain level of kavana, without this kavana, the Tefilah is Tefilah B'chlal. And like I said, that's a whole different topic. So based on all of that, Bashad al pi halacha, kavana and tefilah can't be mekatzer in this beinus and the arichas, even for kedusha. And we see this from a tshuva tzemach tzedek, which the Rebbe is just mitzayin to. Now in that tshuva tzemach tzedek, the question was, should you speed up, should you skip al hanisim in davening in order to hear kedusha, be able to be mishtatif in kedusha and moedim, which you won't make if you continue saying al hanisim. That's the shayla tzemach tzedek. Do we skip something now to get to something that's possibly more important later? So based on that logic of that shuvah, the Rebbe is saying that if the kavana of tefilah is the very most ultimate aspect of tefilah, so then that's the most important thing. You're potter from kedusha and moedim, which is, I guess, Mistama, that's the Maskan of Tzemach Tzedek was that you shouldn't skip al hanisim. So about the gebiss for this. By the way, in that shul, the Tzemach Tzedek also touches on the question of is v'nikdashti, this aspect of Tefilah B'tzibur, is it midiraisa, is it not ayin sham? And by the way, there's also Pashat al pi halacha, there's halacha that if you're not going to be mechaven in the Beis HaKnesses, it says clearly in Shulchan Aruch, yelech v'yispal b'veisib b'koil, and that also could be yisoid for the minig of Chassidim, where if it's for kavana, that's b'negei of that. When it comes to shlichus, so you have the Tzelem Rav. Now, why is he called a Tzelem Rav? So he was a Rav in a city called Deutschkreuz, which means German cross. And the minig in Yiddish was you don't call cities like that by their name. So what do you call it if you don't want to call it Kreuz? You call it Tzelem. So that's why he's the Tzelem Rav. That's the reason. And his name is Reb Levi Yitzchak Greenwald. He was the son of the Arubas Habaysim. Anyway, so he was the Rav in Salem before the war. He immigrated to New York, and he was very involved in kashrus. He was connected to his Achdus, but I think there's also a separate Salem Hechsher, maybe on the Kedem product. He was also very involved in bringing the Chol of Yisrael commercially to America. That was a big deal of his. So he actually has in his shuvas, he has a whole shuvah taking on Rav Moshe's pushed on the reality. Rav Moshe says the companies, they have to follow the law. They're not going to be caught violating the law. He says if you know the mitzias of how it works, you have very small farmers that they have their animals in their farm and they send the milk to the company. And these small farmers have much less of an incentive to stick to the rules and they have an incentive to break the rules, especially argues in the whole mitzias. But when it comes to this question, there's a tshuva, a letter that's printed in his Shas Tshuvas Miglis Merkachim. He had a day. He says, I was asked if you can have a mashkiach for Chol of Yisrael in a place where there are no Yidden, just a farm somewhere. And he won't daven with the minyan. So it was Erev Rosh Hashanah. He says, I don't have time to be married on Erev Rosh Hashanah, being the katzir, but my tamtzas tshuvasi is that Chol of Shechovei Goy Ve'en Yisrael Eyu is treifa. And to save even 1 year from eating treif, you're allowed to daven your whole life without a minyan. Mutar l'spal kol yom b'lei minyan. And if you can't daven at all, oich gut, pater l'gamri mitzvila. Basic mitzvah, pater min mitzvah. You have no greater mitzvah than saving 1 year from eating treif. So mikol shekein to save hundreds from eating treif. That's what the Tzelem Rav wrote. And then, as I was preparing this, I found that the Baruch Oberland actually has a whole article on this in Eretz Yisrael, Muncie Gillian Memvav, and the centerpiece of his shtickle title there is actually this tshuva of the Tzelem Rav, and he notes there not sure what the date of the letter is, but if you look, this actually was sold by a bidding by an auction house in the last couple of years, and the actual original letter, and it says there, Erev Rosh Hashanah Shnas Tavshin Yates. Anyway, you can see in that article, Baruch Abelard, there is marchiv and all the pratim of the gather of Tefilah B'tzibur and the gather of overriding Tefilah B'tzibur for this reason. But the Maskani says, we see that also Rabbanim, even many generations ago, you had Rabbanim that accepted positions in places where they knew that they will not have access to a daily minyan, but it's for the purpose of helping Klal Yisrael. It's like an uncontroversial claim to make, even in the Welt. And I believe many Mechshedim, Adayim Azeh, are sending Mashgichim to places where there's no minyan, onto ships and who knows where. So that's Pashal Halacha L'maisa. So it's not a controversial thing at all to say that to go on Shlichus to help Yidden, to save Yidden, is a problem at Tefilah B'tzibur. We find that Rebbe in Igris, the Chelik Yates, wrote to Rabbi Gansberg that Pashat he had a chiyuv and he was going around and doing chinuch and he couldn't have a minyan. So the Rebbe said, if you want to help the Neftarim, versteht sich that you shouldn't do things that are going to take away from the chinuch al taras hakodesh of bnei Yisrael. Adrabah, you should double down on that, and that will add to the kodesh ruach and aliyas neshmasa. And Benegeya, the Inyana, Lazercha Nishmas. So, you know what? You can learn Mishnayos Barabim, make the Siyum Halimud, Machash Nesuna Malas Hamayra, or whatever, and explain a little bit to the people there, and maybe add a Chassidus Shavart, and then you can say Kaddish to Rabbanon, and you can do that before davening and after davening, so it can help you with the Kaddeshim. Another letter from within a month of that to Rabbi Yisrael Leibov in Eretz Yisrael, that same question. You have Pe'ilim that they're making trips and they miss davening for the Amud, miss for Kaddeshim. So I already said, the Kohen is a Pa'amim, that Pshita, that the Keiras Ruach and the Aliyas and Neshama will not come from taking away from Torah mitzvahs. Chinuch HaTorah HaKadosh is so important. So Adar, we have to be Meisif. And maybe you can hire someone, Yisker, besides for whatever you can say, you should hire someone, and that way you won't lose out on the Beis HaKodesh. So being a Chiyuv is not an excuse to cut back on Pe'ilos. There's also in Chelek Gimel, much earlier, a letter to Reb Chaim Meir Minkowitz of Montreal. There was actually more about a job, to be a sheikhet, a job in Kashrus in a city where there's no minyan. He won't be able to say Kaddish. He's a Chiyuv. He's have to rely on his brothers, but he'll get Parnasa. And he'll be able to pay the bills for the Levaya and the Kvura. So the Rebbe says, Kamadvan Mitiru Chazal for a person's Parnasa. And B'nin Didan, your brothers are saying Kaddish. It's better than hiring a stranger. You'll be able to pay for the Kvura. And Matar Fram already said that you can hire someone to say Kaddish. And the Bizmani at Tefilah, you should get Stalker, Leila Hanashama, and try to be the Mezamin. If you have a benching, to be the Mezamin. Anyway, so that was the Rebbe's attitude. Halacha l'maisa, when it came to people who were going to do a minyan mamish for a chiyuv, the Rebbe still seemed to always say that it's better to do what you're doing, and you'll solve the issue of chiyuv in another way. So kavana, just regular Tefilah B'tzibur. The letter from the Rebbe to Naftali Yunik about being the chazan for a tzibur that I'm not sure Shabbos, we already quoted last week. So anyway, we see the Maskana that Tefilah B'arichis or going on Shlichus has what to base itself on in halachic sources, as the Rebbeim laid it out, and it doesn't take away from the importance of Tefilah B'tzibur in a normal case, in a normal situation where there's no other factors. So now, despite all this Arichis, we're ending here, but of course, this only gives you a tamtzis of what the Mekayos have to say. It's always kedai to look it up yourself, to see it all. Oimek, Yashikayach, Guten Tag.
Send you the overlanders.